I'll just dive right in. So from the 1950s to the early 2000s, the archaeologist Wilhelmina Jastrzębski pioneered archaeological research into Roman gardens, marking a development from the theoretical approach advanced by Pierre Grimmel in 1943. This important work calls scholars to look differently at the wealth of information that gardens contained about the societies which created them. In Pompeii, Jastrzębski's excavations revealed working vineyards and orchards, commercial flower gardens, inn gardens, and vegetable plots. I think we're having some interference. Yet, while she estimated in 1990 that 9.7% of the urban space in Pompeii was made up of gardens producing food, with a further 5.4% devoted to gardens attached to houses and 2.6% attached to public gardens, very little attention has since been paid to the market garden in Pompeii. Most especially, the creation of commercial garden space, particularly within the last years of the city's life, has not been quantified or studied. The limit of investigations into this was the identification of 3 new market gardens in Pompeii by Jastrzębski, all of which had been created out of the space of previous constructions, which were either damaged or destroyed during the major earthquake which hit the town in AD 62. The economic significance of the reassignment of urban space in these and other cases, and what this may tell us about the social relationships and social choices of Pompeian society and space, thus requires more attention if we are to fill the gap between Roman urban space and the study of Roman urban history. As is well accepted, space is a product of the society which creates it. To read space is to reveal much about the social and economic motivations of a population. Space is not a vacuum into which objects are simply placed, but rather a movable and fluid entity. Without the individuals that inhabit and create it, space ceases to exist as anything more than simply a place. For Pompeii, Lawrence summarizes this as follows. It is the urban society that alters the random nature of space and molds space to its needs. In effect, Pompeii and the urban space it contains were social products rather than planned entities. It therefore follows that any marked change in spatial use in the town of Pompeii over a given period represents a significant historical shift worthy of consideration. The identification of this shift and the reasons for it form some of the main points of the inquiry for my thesis. This paper will focus specifically on the one chapter from this, and in so doing, introduce for the first time a new category of archaeological site, the opportunistic garden. In the following paper, I will present new methodologies and findings from an inquiry into new commercial garden space in regions 1 and 2 of Pompeii, seen here to be named opportunistic gardens. In doing this, I will show why the opportunistic garden is significant for understanding urban and economic development in mid-1st century AD Pompeii. The opportunistic garden can be defined as a plot of urban space reorganized for the cultivation of cash crops and sometimes outdoor dining. Such gardens were often created out of space previously occupied by constructions which were demolished or destroyed due to seismic damage. In other cases, these gardens were created from properties reconfigured to maximize the profit of real estate owners. As shall be argued below, opportunistic gardens represent a growing trend in the exploitation of urban space for commercial food production during the final phase of the town. This occurred most notably in the southeastern neighborhood, as we've just seen, nearest to the amphitheater. Final phase of the town I'm defining here as the period spanning from major earthquake in AD 62 up to the eruption of AD 79. Pliny the Younger records the commonplace occurrence of tremors in Campania, with frequent seismic activity in the last years of the town's life, suggested also by the archaeological evidence for damage and repairs, which has been covered a lot in scholarship. Yet while the quakes leading up to the eruption have previously been acknowledged as driving forces for public building renewal mostly, as well as domestic alterations, the effect on garden space hasn't really been looked at in a great deal. As Nappo highlights in his survey of regions 1 and 2, this portion of the town suffered significant damage during the earthquakes in the final 17 years, and as such, houses, shops and gardens locating here underwent a great structural transformation. Economic changes were also at play in urban development at this time. Similar changes as a result of Mediterranean-wide economic shifts have also been found in the buildings facing onto the Via Stabiana by the Porta Stabia excavations directed by Stephen Ellis. New taverns and restaurants were popping up in the 1st century AD in response to economic opportunity. Yet despite these developments, many buildings were still undergoing extensive repair when Vesuvius finally erupted. This was not a town in ruin, or a town abandoned by the wealthy in response to the influx of the poor, as has been suggested previously, but rather a town undergoing positive reinvention and change, or so I think. One element of this was the rise of opportunistic gardens, which we'll take a closer look at here. Regions 1 and 2, the focus of this study, are located, as we have seen, in the southeastern area of the city and hold a large portion of the total number of market gardens that have so far been identified in the town. It is within these two regions that many market gardens appear in the last 17 years of the town's life. In focusing on one neighbourhood where we know earthquake damage occurred, where a large number of market gardens have already been identified, we're provided with an important case study for assessing Pompeii's urban development. But were such developments occurring in regions 1 and 2 more than why was it happening more here than the other 7 regions? Historical contexts such as consumption trends and land ownership can help to answer some of these questions. As Neville Morley tells us, with distance from the market, transport costs rise and the price of land falls. The geographic position of Pompeii and its high fertility made the cultivation of cash crops within the city a favourable endeavour. Indeed, the benefit of cultivating cash crops on urban land must have outweighed the value of residential real estate after AD 62 to make this a profitable option for urban landowners in this part of the town. Given the timing of the eruption, we cannot know if these changes were temporary because we can't see beyond that. Writing in the 1st century AD, Columella tells us that the general population of Rome was eating more garden produce than their forebears. Purcell attributed this supposed increase in demand to a growth in paupertas, those living just above subsistence level in urban areas. This is supported further by evidence for high nutrition levels in the living populations of both Pompeii and Herculaneum, i.e. those who died as a result of the eruption and not a pre-existing condition. Good access to fruit and vegetables as a result of the fertile land in Campania would have contributed to these levels. From this, we can glean that demand for hortus produce, or garden produce, was either stable or growing in the final phase of the town. An important question arises from this. Who was making the decision to favour new agricultural space over residential buildings within the walls? Land ownership may provide some of these answers. So, to the Roman elite of the imperial period, owning urban land was generally considered to be more profitable than owning agricultural land due to the high margins earned from urban rent. Most commonly, one would come to own urban rent or real estate, inclusive of domestic and commercial property, as a result of inheritance or a dowry, the latter to provide funds for one's children in marriage. In such cases, a wealthy individual with real estate in Pompeii was most likely to own not just one unit, but whole or partial insulae, perhaps passed down from the originally assigned parcel during the initial development of these regions from the mid-3rd century BC onwards. And this is an example of what gives you an idea of what an insula is if you're not familiar. Today, an insula is most akin to a block of buildings as one might find, for example, in New York. On the map of Pompeii, these can be seen clearly, mostly as rectangles. 2 examples of rental advertisements from Pompeii demonstrate that a rental economy was occurring in the town. These examples were found in respect to the rental of units within the Praedia di Julia Felix, occupying a whole insula near where I'm looking, and well, within where I'm looking, and the Insula Ariana Poliana. So an absence of municipal controls on land during this period in Italy saw that owners of individual properties had complete jurisdiction over them, with no limits on how they built or modified the land that they owned. The Pompeian law of 82 BC also tells us that those who owned lower floors had authority over the upstairs also. Such laws, in combination with other sources, can go some way to explaining who may have been developing opportunistic gardens at Pompeii. We know, for example, that Cicero drew great profit from the insulae that he inherited in nearby Puteoli, purportedly bringing in around 80,000 to 100,000 sesterces per annum. In a letter from Cicero to Atticus, he states that the subdivision of collapsed or damaged properties in one of his insulae could be used to generate profit through the creation of additional properties for independent rental. This practice was clearly applied at Pompeii due to the evidence for the creation and blocking off of doorways from neighbouring properties and the creation of gardens from demolished buildings. Such details demonstrate that Pompeian property owners, perhaps not renters, were responsible for the extension, demolition, or sale of properties under their own jurisdiction, including garden space. This therefore raises two possibilities for garden development in regions 1 and 2. First, that the productive gardens created in the mid-1st century AD were made from the seismic damage caused to portions of the urban estates owned by wealthy individuals and intended as a source of rent or produce, or both. The second possibility is that individuals of significant wealth were purchasing neighbouring properties or demolition sites for expansion or redevelopment. Both were a possibility and importantly raise the issue of economic motive as driving the creation of an agricultural district inside the walls of the town. Why might the development of these new market gardens have occurred so frequently in regions 1 and 2 over others? The proximity of this neighbourhood to two main gates in Pompeii and the trade routes beyond may provide one motive, as might orientation and aspect. Regions 1 and 2 are on a southerly slope, said by Columella to be beneficial to agricultural endeavour. Other motives may include access to markets and fixed trading outlets in the town, good cart access, as well as nearby access for fountains and water. The benefit of a supportive neighbourhood of other agricultural workers may have been a driving factor eventually also, though no studies have focused on this yet in great detail. The active culture of property subdivision and rental in Pompeii thus provides an opportunity for profit on behalf of urban landowners in answer to a persistent or growing demand for horticultural produce at this time. There's also the possibility that those renting these gardens were paying their rent in kind with the produce cultivated on site. Though circumstances likely differed by site, we can be certain that the rise in market gardens was linked to economic and urban space opportunity. Before analysing a selection of these opportunistic gardens from Pompeii, I'll now introduce the methodology that I use to identify these gardens. Architectural features sit at the centre of the identity of the opportunistic garden, the reading of which allows us to identify and differentiate them from the other recreational and perhaps pre-AD 62 established market gardens in the town. A variety of features can be used to identify an opportunistic garden. To aid further analysis, these gardens can then be categorised further into market gardens, dining gardens, or a combination of both, which forms another part of my research. I won't cover that today, but I will go over these briefly, and then I'll show you some of the gardens, which is the best bit, obviously. So some of the identifying features that I have listed are as follows: blocked doorways into open garden spaces, the addition of or preservation of doorways, the archaeological remains of walls, the building pattern of single or multiple insulae, evidence for ramps in association with an open space, a storage or processing facility, and evidence for the cultivation of vegetables, fruit, and or nut trees, often indicated by furrows and root cavities. In all cases, one must first look, of course, for an open space before attempting to identify any of the key features mentioned above. These features can occur alone or in combination with one or more of the others. Supplementary features most often include an outdoor masonry triclinium, a treading floor, a cistern, or an irrigation system for watering plants, all of which you can find and all of which have been found in many of the gardens. As is always the case with archaeological investigation, the conclusions we make about these gardens in Pompeii are limited to the information that's been gleaned from excavations so far. And of course, the conditions for conservation in the site today often limit subsoil excavations, which may reveal earlier structures, so we'll just have to wait for those where we need them. Despite this, access to floor plans and archaeological reports, especially in the PBMP, which Eric Poehler has directed, can aid in an identification of opportunistic gardens in the city. So I will now show you a number of these. To date, I have identified a total of 21 opportunistic gardens in regions 1 and 2. You can see them as the green stars. For regions 3 to 9, I've found only 8. This map shows all of the gardens so far identified by myself. This total culminates to an average of 10.5 gardens per region in regions 1 and 2, and only 1.1 gardens per region in 3 to 9, revealing a significantly higher percentage of commercial gardening in the southeastern portion of the city. When compared with total market garden figures that I've found to date, a definite dominance of opportunistic gardens over pre-existing market gardens can be seen, meaning that the majority of market gardens in the town were created in the last phase of the town's development. It may well be, with further excavations or research, that some of the properties I've identified as market gardens were in fact also new additions to the town in the last 17 years, though we would need further evidence for this. When plotted, a group of the opportunistic gardens can be seen in the insulate either side of the Via di Nocera, which is near the large palestra, the big rectangle, and 3 western insulae of region 2. Such a development line aligns with Nappo's findings of where the destruction was greatest in this portion of the town in the earthquake of AD 62. So I'll now show you a sample of these, and I'll take you through the methodology at the same time. So there are a few things to note about opportunistic gardens found so far in Pompeii. These gardens almost always make up the largest space within each property that they occupy and have not yet been found adjoined to any residential domi, though evidence for possible synacula and pergolae, the living areas of low-income families, can sometimes be found in adjoining internal rooms. Almost always, opportunistic gardens are attached to working or storage spaces where evidence for the storage and processing of crops or byproducts have in some cases been found. The following will be structured by the identifying features useful for identifying these gardens. So, a methodology which takes blocked doors, demolished walls, and other supplementary features as indicators of these gardens act as a development of the building schemata of Pompeian insulae produced by Nappo in relation to the building patterns of insulae in regions 1 and 2. So he looked at regions 1 and 2 and decided that these were the most of the ways that they were developed, as developed from Hoffman, as you can see. These images illustrate the general building lines along which they were built from the late 3rd century BC onwards. In using an expanded version of this model, we're able to make use of the information we have about the complex and pronounced construction history of these 2 regions. In original building layouts, one would most often find domi with garden space to the rear and very few instances of upper floors, many of which were added after the earthquake of AD 62 in this area. So that's just the original. Where buildings of the AD 79 level are found to differ greatly from the 4 schemas seen here, it may be possible to identify an opportunistic garden space to start from. In this, we use the orientation of property frontages as a guide. One example of this can be seen in the properties at entrances 9 and 14 in Insula 113. So you can see I've marked out roughly where they may have lay, if this is the case. At surface level, these 2 large open spaces stand out in an insula otherwise densely populated, being originally built to schema number 2. The extension of these 2 gardens post AD 62 ate into portions of east to west and now north to south facing plots to create larger or new garden spaces for cash crop cultivation at 113.14, which is on the left with the little circles in it, that's dahlia, and 113.19, which is on the right. The addition of further identifying features, such as blocked doors and demolished walls, help us to make gain further information about these. A further 2 examples show this further. The Calpona of the Gladiators and the House of the Cylindrical Columns were both extensive properties made larger by the incorporation of neighbouring structures into an original building pre-AD 62 and the demolition of constructions to make way for a new garden space post-AD 62. Both significantly modified the original building layouts of the insulae in which they sat. At a service level, these changes can be charted by looking at the position of blocked doors on interior and exterior walls, as well as the position of demolished walls still existent in fragments. Such features, when combined with schemes, enable us to appreciate the extent to which agricultural space were being prioritised over residential in these regions at these times by property owners. They were large spaces which, in the centre of town, perhaps closer to the Forum, may have been higher value of real estate. It also reveals a growing culture of individuals either purchasing neighbouring properties to extend space, or else reorganising the space within their existing groups of urban properties. I'll now take you through demolished walls and onto blocked doors after that, and then we'll have a look at the supplementary features. A number of properties from our case study exhibit the remains of demolished walls, the remnants either of seismic damage or having been demolished to create new space. You can see them here in the Garden of Hercules, which is positioned close to the Porta Nocera on the southern town wall, which shows evidence for 3 jutting demolished walls in the garden space. Nappo notes that this garden space previously held 4 other houses, all built along the same design of schema number 1, before being demolished to accommodate a large commercial flower garden complete with a masonry triclinium, which is the U-shape, upside down U. Ferro and Columella note the profitability of keeping a garden cultivated with flowers close to a city for garlands, while Pliny the Elder separately references the growing trade in perfume at this time, much to his distaste. This garden is an excellent example of a property owner reorganising his property for economic opportunity in cash crop cultivation, as well as the profit to be made from passing foot trade and cart trade entering the city via the necropolis, where garlands would be put to use. In the same insula and positioned even closer to the gate were further examples of property owners, perhaps the very same owner as the Garden of Hercules, exploiting the economic opportunity created by travellers entering the city at the Porta Nocera. The 3 commercial properties had been created and modified from their previous traditional structures as narrow domi with rear gardens in order to accommodate guests for dining. This was achieved via the demolition of walls located in the same position in properties 1 and 2/3 in order to extend the garden spaces, and they are here, you can see them here. Demolished walls in these cases provide invaluable information regarding the constructions which were removed in order to accommodate gardens, yet they're not always possible to detect where excavations below the eruption level cannot be made. In such cases, blocked doors are key for identifying the position of previous constructions, in some cases, prior to the existence of a garden space, in addition to properties with direct access for garden workers and guests. I'll now look at these a little more closely. So, blocked doors, when viewed in combination with building schemes, can be used in many insulated chart structural developments. Blocked doors, when not labelled, can be identified by a short intersecting line through a wall with a circle at each end. As with demolished walls and building schemes, blocked doors can be used to chart development at micro and macro levels. At 1:13:14, which we saw earlier, evidence for 3 blocked doorways, once the front entrances of demolished east-west properties built along scheme number 2 were blocked in antiquity, likely post AD 62. The wide entrance at 14 was possibly added or expanded during this time, along with the partial demolition of an internal wall to allow access via a step to the property from entrance 12 to 13, which is to the south. The area in 14 appears to have been used as a stable or a storage area. The trough, which is the little rectangle here, may be a trough, and a ramp at the entrance here. This wide entrance is one of the 36 ramps identified by Eric Poehler in the town, a crucial factor which reveals a growing investment in commercial endeavour related to cash crop gardening. Poehler puts it as such: the decision to invest in transport-related services generally, so example inns and taverns, and infrastructures specifically, such as ramps and stables, shows the importance of this sector on the overall economy and establishes establishes it as a particular driving force in the development of the urban landscape. This investment in commercial space is made even more certain by the vines known to have been cultivated here at the time of the eruption, in addition to the 7 dahlia embedded in the garden, so you can see them here. The owner of these properties clearly saw the value in vine cultivation in Pompeii when making the decision not to rebuild damaged residential constructions here after AD 62. A further 3 examples at the neighbouring garden of 113-9 reveal the original construction of this insula as being built along the lines defined by Hoffman. This combination of features allows us to ascertain that a total of 3 properties at 113-12 to 14 were demolished and 2 reattributed in order to create a garden with working storage areas. In the same insula, a further 3 properties, plus a portion of another, were demolished to create the garden at 113-9 on the right. A similar case can be found at 112-9/14, these are not easy to say, where 2 doors, likely to the entrance to a domestic forces and adjoining to Venner, so you can see them there where the arrow is, were blocked off to create a secure garden with only 1 access point from the garden directly. These examples show the value of viewing blocked doors and demolished walls together and independently, along with building schemes, to identify potential opportunistic gardens in Pompeii. 2 final features remain, these being the evidence for direct access to garden spaces and supplementary features. So direct access had multiple benefits in the productive garden of antiquity, providing ease of access for workers and removing the need to traverse indoor areas en route to the garden, in addition to facilitating the loading of carts with crops. Collecting water from local street fountains would have also been eased. The garden categories mentioned previously are useful for analysing direct access. Market gardens, or those used for cash crop production only, differ from market dining gardens in that they do not exhibit any permanent dining furniture such as masonry triclinia. The category of market dining gardens refers only to the evidence for dining fixtures in the garden, given that this is taken in my research as related directly to the experience of the garden and the economic opportunities of the garden. Only 38% of commercial gardens in regions 1 and 2 allowed direct access from the street to the main garden space. It's not shown here, but interestingly, 89% of commercial gardens with no direct access were used purely for cash crop cultivation, likely providing extra security for the produce grown within. The remainder of market gardens with direct access, numbering only 3, had masonry triclinia in the space of the garden, likely used in a semi-public capacity. Considering the evidence that we found from Pompeii relating to public banquets on triclinia, as for example in a funerary inscription listing over 400 triclinia used in a public banquet in Pompeii, there is a high possibility that many of the market dining gardens were being used for dining on a temporary basis, either by the owner and his guests at private feasts, or by individuals renting them out for dining events. Collegia are another option, and religious societies. Alternatively, they may have been used as a dining area for customers of Pompeii. All possibilities would have contributed towards an alternative revenue stream for the owner of the opportunistic garden. Direct access to these spaces would have served to preserve interior areas for working and storage without the need for customers to navigate across them. On the flip side, there are various examples of doors having been closed off and limiting access from the street, as in the Garden of Hercules. This was likely for the protection of produce from thieves. Ancient writers discussing the garden often refer to security, with the god of livestock, fruit plants, and fertility Priapus often charged with the protection of produce in the garden. Jaschemski references many instances of guard dog remains being excavated in the large gardens of Pompeii. She actually, in her memoirs, says that she's never found one without a guard dog in it, or what she assumes is a guard dog, must be. While evidence for shards of amphorae cemented into the tops of garden walls infer a willingness to deter thieves. You can see an example of that here. So, while direct access cannot be used as a primary indicator of a possible market garden, the data here shows that market gardens are more likely to allow restricted access while market dining gardens are more prone to do the opposite, presumably for the attraction of customers. Other features can provide information about the use of market gardens in antiquity, and these are supplementary features. So I'll have a look at these very quickly, and then I'll move on to my conclusion. Supplementary features provide additional information for the possible functions of opportunistic gardens, and more abstractly, possible dates of garden establishment, using, for example, the age of root cavities as a means for estimating a garden's age sometimes. One example of a property with important supplementary features relating to its cultivation can be found in Insula 2.1. This property exhibits the following features: demolished walls, a blocked door between the garden and the interior areas, 2 direct access points at 7B and 8 to the garden, a large masonry triclinium with altar, an outdoor serving table, a well, a kitchen adjoined to the garden, a treading floor, and a garden cultivated with vines. Accommodation on an upper floor may also have been accessed via an internal staircase. The original building scheme of the insula to scheme number 3 and the irregularity of the space indicate that a property was likely demolished to make way for this garden. It's quite big in real life. I mean, it looks rather small there, but it's quite big. It can be considered opportunistic due to its high level of accessibility to non-household members, as we have seen in other market dining gardens, in addition to the archibotanical and material finds here, which indicate productive cultivation and dining. It's likely that the masonry triclinium was hired out or used as a place to serve guests food from the garden and the adjoining kitchen. The table along the north wall has been taken to be a serving table by excavators, and actually I didn't put that on there, but that was around here. Evidence for the processing of grapes grown here at the treading floor, over here, add even more to our knowledge of how this garden was used at the time of its destruction in 79 AD. Not only was it being used for cultivation, but also for dining and wine preparation. The property is therefore an example of multiple commercial opportunities being produced from the space of a demolished property, the conclusions of which we can only fully come to with the consideration of these supplementary features. From a working perspective, the House of the Ship Europa provides another example of this. The market garden in the property was of a size akin to 3 others in the area of the town, which I won't cover here, but there are 3 others, and was served by the indoor space of a converted domestic property where amphorae were stored and washed for reuse. Its previous residential use is suggested by the presence of an peristyle, used as storage areas by the workers of this property. A similar scenario can be found in the Garden of Hercules that we saw before. On the lower of the garden's 2 terraces, so you can see them here, and well, here, and there's around here somewhere. You would go up, there's little stairs here basically, so you go here, it sort of goes down, as I was saying, in a southerly slope. On the lower of these gardens' 2 terraces, remains of demolished walls can be seen to the east and west, while a total of 4 doors were closed off in antiquity. 1 direct access doorway was either preserved or created during its construction. So that's number 4 here. The excavation of 416 root cavities, including vines, plus the evidence for 2 vegetable patches, colour information about the structural alterations made at this property. In addition to this, 2 cisterns, a drainage channel for water, 28 embedded terracotta pots, more than 1 dolium, a large number of amphorae in the southeastern corner of the portico, which you can see here, and the large graffiti of the ship Europa on the northern wall of the peristyle provide further evidence for the commercial conversion of this domestic property, most probably at some point during the 1st century AD. The majority of vine root cavities being small and thus young hint at the relatively young age of this garden. So supplementary features provide key information regarding the function of an opportunistic garden at the time of the eruption. In all cases, these features create an impression of a living space as opposed to a static floor plan, which, when considered in combination with evidence for blocked doorways and all the rest of it, allow us to make some informed analyses about the alteration and use of these properties in regions 1 and 2 for commercial profit. So I now reach my conclusion. This paper has demonstrated, I hope, the importance of this brand new category of archaeological site for reconstructing urban development and land use in the final years of Pompeii's life. This builds significantly on the work of Jastrzębski in market garden archaeology and where she was going, and contributes to important discussions surrounding urbanism in the town. This new methodology, I hope, will allow scholars in the future to start identifying a commercial garden which was developed in antiquity from damaged, destroyed, or repurposed constructions as a result of seismic damage or property sale and development. The resilience of Region 1 and 2 in the face of the extensive seismic damage it suffered has been demonstrated by the rapid developments taking place in the short 17 years between the earthquake of 62 and the eruption of 79. Landowners and residents were creating opportunity from disaster in response to the zeitgeist of this time, answering demands for garden produce and new dining experiences. These findings therefore support Lawrence's attestation that Pompeii and the urban space it contains were social products rather than planned entities. This is a town not only surviving, but creating opportunity from disaster, the effects of which have served to exhibit the centrality of garden space and agriculture to Pompeii's final residents. Thank you very much.